All right, as soon as I get this computer going, we will go over 2.5 on deriving conclusions. Pay close attention to the next reading because we are not doing the next section, 2.6, which is on Venn diagrams. If you like Venn diagrams, feel free to read it on your own. It might be helpful to you, but we will not be going over that in class or including it on our exams. That's excruciatingly slow. Yeah, this kiosk has a virus or something. It should not go this slow. All right, well, while that's getting booted up, if it ever gets booted up, we're going to go over a four-step test to derive conclusions from premises alone in Aristotelian logic. Sort of just any initial overview questions. Hopefully we'll have some time to get to some exercises at the end. I fear that the computer is eating up my time. And so how did it go? Was this intuitive and easy? Was it hard? How do we do on this? I mean, I think 3 of the 4 steps are pretty easy. I think the only step that's a little bit tricky is finding the form of the conclusion. Probably the best way to deal with that, frankly, is to take your book, slap it on a photocopier, find the page that has the chart, make yourself a photocopy of that chart, print it out or photocopy it, and then just post it somewhere where you can memorize it and refer to it frequently. Frankly, after you've done it 10 or 20 times, the patterns, frankly, get easier to spot. So although it's really complicated the first time you look at it, it sounds intimidating, it's really not. It's really not. All right, this kiosk is still moving at the speed of dirt. All right, let's see. All right, so 4 steps. Step 1, when you are trying to derive conclusions. Step 1 is to translate the premises into logic and to do a mini star test. What we mean by a mini star test is this. When you get the, when you take your premises and you distribute the terms and underline and star the distributed terms, sometimes you will be able to identify just based on that, that no possible valid arguments can be made. And there are 3 circumstances where that is the case. If you have an argument where a capital letter appears twice and it hasn't been starred. So something like this. All A is B, all C is B. We then distribute and star. And on step 1, we can immediately tell that this cannot be valid. Why can't this be valid? Because B already appears twice, and what doesn't it have? It hasn't received a star. So since it already appears twice, it can't appear a 3rd time in the argument, and there's no way that it's going to end up with a star. So just based on these 2 premises, I know that this isn't going to be a valid argument. So then you can write invalid on it and skip ahead to the next problem. Another one where this would happen is if you have this pattern. No A is B, no C is B, and because those are no's, you've got all 4 terms underlined and starred. This can't be valid either, no matter what conclusion you have. Why? Well, because the B already has 2 stars. And if you have any capital letter that has 2 stars, then again, the argument's going to be invalid no matter what conclusion you try to put on it. Another problem, which is also displayed in this problem, is if you have an argument where you already have 2 stars on the right. And here we already have 2 stars on the right. So that is a 3rd way that just based on premises that you can identify that no valid conclusion is possible. All right, so here's the 4-step test. Step 1 is translate the premises, distribute the terms in the premises, and star. Step 2, which is actually very easy, figure out the terms, letters that belong in the conclusion. Step 3, which is the only difficult one in my opinion, is figure out the form of the conclusion. That's where you need the chart. And then step 4, add the conclusion and do the star test on the final argument. So that is the 4 steps. We've talked a little bit about step 1. Let me skip ahead to step 2. Step 2 is to figure out the terms / letters in the conclusion. After you've translated and underlined, distributed, and starred the premises, then you figure out which 2 letters belong in the conclusion. And how do you do that? Well, you use the counting power of 2. You figure out which letters appear only once in the premises, and those are the ones that will be repeated in the conclusion, because each term, each letter in a syllogism appears only twice. So if you can figure out which ones have only occurred once, then those are the ones that you're going to need in your conclusion. So easiest principle ever, count to 2. Any term that appears twice, you don't need in the conclusion. Any term that appears only once belongs in the conclusion. And if you've translated properly, there should be exactly 2 terms that have appeared only once. If you have more or less than 2 terms that appear only once, you have mistranslated something, and you have to go back and try to translate again. Then the only difficult one, in my opinion, figure out the form of the conclusion, and you follow the rules on the chart in section 2.5. First principle, anytime you have a negative conclusion, you will attempt, anytime you have at least one negative premise, you are going to need a negative conclusion. A premise is negative if it has the words no or not anywhere in it. So if there is a no or a not in any of the premises, even one, then you will need a no or a not in the conclusion. So that's principle 1. And that applies to all patterns. If both conclusion letters are capital letters, then you check the premises to see if they're all universal claims. A universal claim is a claim that is an all or a no claim. It is a sweeping claim. If all of your premise claims are universal claims, then you need a universal claim in your conclusion. So if all of your premises are all or no premises, then you need an all or a no in the conclusion. If you have 2 capital letters, but you do not have all universal premises, then you need a sum as the first word in your conclusion. And your conclusion will either be sum is or sum is not. You add the not if there are any negative premises. If there are no negative premises, you just use sum. All right, if you have one small conclusion letter, then the 2 patterns that it could be are either little x is capital letter or little letter is not capital letter. And again, if one of the terms in the conclusion is small and one is big, you use one of those 2 patterns. Use the negative pattern if there is at least one negative premise. If both conclusion letters are small, then the form of the conclusion is either going to be little x is capital Y, or little x is not, little x is little y, or little x is not little y. And again, you use the one with not if there is any negative premises. All right, questions about that? Because I think that's the hardest step. Then you add the conclusion and do the star test. If the argument is invalid, then you're not done yet, because you have to try one thing. You have to swap the positions of the letters in the conclusion, make the first term the second term, and the second term the first term. Because sometimes, for certain forms, that will change the validity, and that will give you a valid conclusion. Finally, you put the conclusion in English. All right, so here, I will do an example for you. And one of the things we want to do is we want to try to think about things intuitively. The more you can spot the directions that things should go before you even attempts to use the tools, the better. Now, because basically the goal here is to check your intuition, use the tools, and see if your intuition was correct. Because at a certain point, you want to sort of train your intuition to be correct. And the more of these you do, the better we'll be off. So here, some cave dwellers use fire. All who use fire have intelligence. So what we have here are three terms: cave dwellers, fire users, and those who are intelligent. And I can see sort of intuitively right away, even without using the tools, the final conclusion is going to relate cave dwellers and those who have intelligence in some way, probably with a sum. All right, but let's look at this step by step. Step one, translate and star. Some cave dwellers use fire. Some capital C is capital U. All who use fire have intelligence. All capital U is capital I. All right, we do the mini star test. That's going to be potentially valid. We don't prove that doesn't prove that it's valid, but we don't have any rules broken yet. The U's got the star that it needs. The C and the I will probably get a star in the conclusion, and hopefully we'll get a star on the right. So this can potentially be valid. So step one, it passes. Step two, what's step two? Figure out the terms in the conclusion. What are the terms in the conclusion going to be? The terms in the conclusion are actually going to be C and I. U already appears twice. So we don't actually, I just said you, so I drew you. But yeah, the terms in the conclusion have to be C and I. All right, what's our third step? Figure out the form of the conclusion. What's the form of the conclusion going to be? Yeah, so we're going to have to use a sum. Why did you choose a sum? Good. So we have two capital letters. Then we check to see if these are all universal. Because there's a sum up here, it's not universal. Now, why didn't you use a not over here? Good. There's no negatives already. Good. And what's our final step? What's that? Check it for validity. Yeah, we're going to check it for validity. So we star the C and the I in the conclusion because we star the undistributed terms in the conclusion, and we check to see each capital letter has a star. There's exactly one on the right. It's valid. And then the final thing we do is we translate the conclusion back into English, which says some cave dwellers are those who have intelligence. All right, did you see how that worked? Any questions? Yes. In this case, no, because both terms would still be undistributed in the conclusion, and they would both still have stars, so that would be equally correct. However, there are some patterns where it will be valid in one pairing, but in one way, but not if you do it the other. So I think the two, anything with an all in front of it or anything with a not in the middle will only be valid if you do it one way, but it would not be valid if you do it the other. So, so if you get invalid the first time, you try swapping them.
And you should do this star test to determine that every time.
Yes.
Not try to write it out.
I would trust the star test. I mean, we want to train our intuition to decide, but right now we're relying on the star test. Good. Let's just do some practice together. I'm fed up with that computer right now, so I'm not going to use that interface today. All human acts are determined. All H is D. No determined X are free. No D is F. We do our mini star test. And it passes the mini star test as at least potentially valid because we've got one on the right and one on each capital letter. We then figure out what belongs in the conclusion. The conclusion is going to be an H and an F because H and F only appear once. We're going to figure out the form of the conclusion. The form of the conclusion is going to be a no. How do we know that? Because we have two universal terms and one of them is negative. Then we distribute and star the not distributed terms in the conclusion. Since they're both distributed, neither gets the star. And it is valid. And then we can translate the conclusion back into English. No human acts are free acts. All right. How are we doing on all that? Does all that make sense? All right, well, let's practice some exercises together. Why don't you tell me which ones you didn't understand, thought were confusing, and so forth. So where do we start? Which one can I do for you? Yes, sir.
Number 15.
Number 15. Jones likes raw steaks. Jones likes champagne. Jones sounds like fun in my book. All right. Oops. Jones, little j, is capital R. Jones, little j, is capital C. We do an initial star test, and nothing gets distributed, underlined, or starred. It's going to be potentially valid. Now, remember, Jones is lowercase, so Jones, the lowercase, isn't going to end up with a star, but that's okay because it's lowercase. Then we figure out what belongs in the conclusion. We're going to need an R and a C. We then figure out, do we need a universal? Do we need an all or no, or do we need a sum? And we're going to need a sum because these are two capital letters. And they're two capital letters, but we don't have two universal premises, so we need a sum. And we don't need a negation because there's no negation in the premises. Then we do the star test. And it's going to pass. Now, here's where I think some people get confused. If you think this conclusion says some raw steaks are champagne, that will sound really wrong, and you would be correct. Raw steaks are not champagne. That would be disgusting. But that's not what these two categories stand for. What are the two categories in the conclusion? Right. So this conclusion says some people who like raw steaks are people who like champagne. And that makes sense. Some people like Jones. All right, so does that help? Good. All right, what other ones can we go over? 11. I weigh 180 pounds. My mind does not weigh 180 pounds. All right. I, little I, because I am one specific guy. I is, I'll do capital W. I am in the group of people who weigh 180 pounds. I wish. Little m, my mind, is in, I'm sorry, wait, no, that's not right. My mind does not weigh 100. Yeah, okay. My mind is not in the group of things that weigh 180 pounds. We do an initial star test and we see that since the only capital gets starred and we got exactly one on the right, this looks promising, it's potentially valid. We need a little I and a little m in the conclusion. And we need a not, because there is a not in a premise. We distribute and we star, and the argument is valid. And the conclusion is, of course, that I am not my mind. By the way, if you think you are your mind, there's a way to fix this so that this doesn't disprove it. You just reject premise one. You just say, I don't really weigh 180 pounds. Just my body weighs 100, just my body weighs 180 pounds. But that's not really me if you really believe that you are just your mind, full stop. So that's how you would avoid that. All right, so does that help? Good. 23. Yes, 23 we can do. All right, 23. Some actions approved by reformers are right. Some actions approved by society are not approved by reformers. Let me check that. I think that's right. Some actions approved by reformers are right. Some actions approved by society are not approved by reformers. All right, so the whole difficulty here is going to be with translating properly. And what they've done to you is actions approved by reformers and actions approved by society have to be two different categories. And you shouldn't be fooled by actions approved by. That's not that isn't any category. So the A here is actions approved by reformers. The R here is things that are right. The S here is actions approved by society. If you get those three, if you get this term, this concept the same, and these two different from each other and from this term, you're going to be fine. But what they did is they gave you a bunch of terms that you'll want to use the same letter as. So, you would be tempted to translate this one as an R. So once you do that, you're going to be fine. So this is potentially valid. Then we put an S and an R in the conclusion. Because they're both capital and these aren't universals, you need a sum. Because there's a negation, you need is not. Distribute. Star. And that's going to be invalid. But then you don't want to stop there. You need to swap the order to see if that changes anything. And you still fail the star test because you don't have a way to get a third star out there. So that argument is invalid.
You can't have an answer that is invalid. Even though, we're both trying to figure out a way to make it valid sometimes. Look at that. I think most of the answers, when I did at least got valid for
Yeah, a couple of these are invalid no matter what you do.
Okay.
Or to say it differently, there are some premises that no matter what, there are no valid conclusions that follow from those premises. And this is one of those cases. So I guess there were two things that were confusing. One is the translation, and then the other is that it's invalid no matter what you do with it. Good. What else we got? Yes, sir. 16. Ah, yes. Revenge. 16. Some human beings seek self-destructive revenge. Some H is R. No one seeking self-destructive revenge is motivated only by self-interest. No R is M. Now note, one thing that might confuse us here is the only, right? But only does what? Only introduces what? Only always introduces the second term. So because the placement of the word only is halfway through, it feels like that's how you would naturally translate it. But if you're thinking only has to make it very different, then that will confuse you there. So we have no R is M. All purely selfish people are motivated only by self-interest. All S is M. We then do a mini star test. All right, looks promising because all the R and the M's both appear twice, but we have a star in each of them, so it's promising. We need H and S in the conclusion. We're going to need a sum because not every statement is universal, and we're going to need an is not because of that negation. We're going to distribute the S and start the H. And look at that. That's a valid argument because we have stars in every capital letter and exactly one on the right. And it translates back as some human beings are not purely selfish people, such as those seeking self-destructive revenge. Weirdly enough. Cool. What can I do next for us? Yes. 13. Ah, yes. Um, All unproven beliefs ought to be rejected. All capital U is capital O. There is a God is an unproven belief. Because it's in quotes, it is one specific claim we're referring to. So what we have here is a little g. The quotes, the claim that there is a God, is capital U. Then we do the quick star test, and it's potentially valid. We need a little g and a capital O in the conclusion. There's no negation, so it's just going to be an is. Then we star the undistributed terms in the conclusion, and it's going to be valid. By the way, the problem with this argument is in the very next problem, number 14. All right, so but they're both structurally valid arguments. All right, what else can I cover for us? So you all got all the rest of these correct? Yes. 20. All basic moral norms hold for all possible rational beings as such. All B is R. No principles based on human nature hold for all possible rational beings as such. No P is R. Do a mini star test. looks promising. Then we decide what we need in the conclusion. We need a B and a P. We need a universal term. It's going to be universal negative. And it's valid. I think what's tricky about that one is the categories that give you are just very, very long and unwieldy. Yes, ma'am. 19. Okay. Number 19. God is a perfect being. Little g is capital P. In Western culture, when we refer to use the term God in traditional usage, we're referring to one specific, all-powerful, invisible, all-knowing being. Perfect being. Now, it might be unclear whether or not there can be more than one perfect being, but in the sentence, since we use the indefinite article a, this indicates that this is a category using a capital term, a capital letter, not a lowercase. So God is a perfect being. All perfect beings know everything. All P is K. All capital P is capital K. All beings that know everything are influenced by everything. All K is capital I. All right, we do a mini star test. Yeah, that looks promising. Looks like it could be valid. Then we decide what we need in the conclusion. We're going to need a little g and a capital I. We start the undistributed terms in the conclusion, and we end up with one on the right, one on each of the three capital letters. It's valid. And the conclusion claim is that God is influenced by everything. How's that? Does that help? Good. Anything else? I think this section is a good illustration of why it's so important to master the early steps, the early skills. Because if you're still struggling with translating, it comes back and bites you on this exercise. And if you struggle with the STAR test and don't have the STAR test mastered, it bites you on this exercise. So again, this is one of those places where the skills are building on each other. And if you're having a problem with these exercises, you should ask yourself, where is the problem? Is the problem a translation problem? Is the problem that you don't understand how the STAR test works? Or is the problem is that you don't know how to derive conclusions? So often the biggest challenge you face is correctly diagnosing what it is you need to learn and master. How about one more before we go? Yes, sir. 24. Some wrong actions or errors made in good faith. Some capital W is capital E. No error made in good faith is blameworthy. No E is B. And these are all capitals. Then we distribute the star. It's potentially valid because we've got just one star on the right. We've got a star on the E. So it looks promising. We need a capital W and a capital B in the conclusion. These are not two universal terms, so we need a sum. And we have a negation, so we need a not in the conclusion. And that's valid. So some wrong actions are not blameworthy. Yes, sir.
Do you realize, oh, when you need a, is not in the conclusion?
I know that I need an is not because I have a negative term. So the no is what triggers the is not. Also, if I had a not, that also would trigger a not in the conclusion. And if I had multiple no's and nots, that would still trigger a not in the conclusion. So if you have one or two once you have one, you know you're going to need a negation in the conclusion.
Why does it not go in the beginning? How do we know? Like, not know?
That's because that is ruled out by the first question I ask, do I have all universal terms? So the sum is what prevents this from being an all or a no. All right, on that note, see you next time. Follow the syllabus. Do not read the next section. Do the next section that is noted on the syllabus. Thank you. See you on Wednesday. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you. Thank you. You too. Jess, I did get your email. Are you sending me more documents after that, or is that all you're sending? Okay, that's fine. Do you know when the deadline is? Okay. Well, here's the good news for you. If you miss the deadline, that doesn't mean all is lost. All it means is that instead of changing your incomplete to your new grade, I will have to change the rest. So, I mean, of course, you never want something to. Actually, no. Now, some questions will do. But yeah.
I was, yeah, it's Sunday, I'm trying to work on the paper.
I'm sorry.
Just haven't heard back. I contacted the registrar's office, back. So, I'm gonna grab lunch and then, probably see if I don't know if the registrar's in that building or not.
I mean, you just need to block them, you know. I hope you block them.
So there's money involved. A lot,
Of course there is.
of course there is. So, is we're gonna get half of it, but there's still like another 1,000 that he owes me, and then when he pays that, then I can't just. Is he in this class right now? Like, online?
What's that?
Is he in this class like online?
I doubt it. I'm not aware. What's your ex's name? I'll check if you. Here, let's not put that up. Oh yeah, that's fine.